Well, oh, we have 9 participants already here. That's great.
Yes, good morning, Rabbi. I'm going to leave my video off. You don't need to see my lovely Punim today.
Oh, the picture's nice.
A picture? What do you mean?
Oh, the
Oh,
picture you have instead of your video camera.
oh, I don't know how that works. You see a picture of me?
Yeah, when you sign up with Zoom, if you put a picture in the thing, they show the picture instead of your name when you're not using your camera.
So you're looking at like videos of Howard, and for me, you see a picture of me?
A picture of you in front of a bookcase, just your face. Yeah,
Huh. Yeah, no, I know which picture you're talking about. I just didn't know that that showed
yeah,
to everyone.
yep, yep. All right. Well, I guess we're almost ready to. Yeah, I guess we're ready to get started.
I forgot to print out your the details. But
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to kind of go through them as we go through the class today. So,
They're on the webpage.
yeah, they are.
yeah,
You can also get them on the webpage, right? Yeah.
I know, but
All
I'm
right. So I'll start by sharing the screen here. Oh, I have to.
Oh, you will. Hold on one second.
Jennifer has to let me do that first.
I do.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, good. All right. So, here we go. Unorthodox Jewish beliefs. So there we are. Um, So when we left off in our last exciting episode, I had thoroughly confused some people with the idea that maybe Moses didn't write the 5 books of Moses, maybe a more complicated story involving at least 4 different sources that were edited together, and that those sources were based on probably an orally transmitted history that existed for some time before they were written down, and that the finally edited together 5 books of Moses came from Ezra the scribe, or at least around that time, but Richard Elliott Friedman says it was indeed Ezra the scribe. After all, that's what scribes do. They write and they're masters of the sources. So in any case, around that time, the 5 books of Moses reaches its final form. But if that's the case, then what is the authority of the Torah? I mean, it's a much easier case to be made if you said that, well, God just dictated the 5 books of Moses word for word to Moses at Mount Sinai, and and then you would have the answer. But if God didn't just dictate it to Moses word for word, then is it still the word of God? Does it still have the same authority? So what I want to do today is start by considering a more general question, which is, can God speak words to human beings? And if God can, does God speak actual words to human beings? So as you probably know by now, my view is I try to base what I believe on science, and scientifically, the way human beings speak words is we have a physical body, obviously. We have lungs that capture air, and the air we push that air through our vocal cords, which produce sounds, and then we shape those sounds from our vocal cords with our mouth, with our teeth, our tongue, the way our lips are formed, etc., all shape the different sounds that we make that we call language. But of course, God doesn't have a body, and therefore God has none of these things. How does God make sounds? Sounds are made by things in 3-dimensional space, you know, causing noise, like clapping hands or something like that. So if God doesn't have mouth, it doesn't have lungs, doesn't have teeth, lips, etc., how does God make sounds? So my initial answer based on this would be that God can't do that. Now that offends some people because, right, God can do anything. God's perfect. God can do anything. But so I guess, okay, so theoretically, let's say God could do things, but my view is God does not interfere with the laws of physics. And the laws of physics require a physical entity to make noise. Um, that doesn't mean that God can't communicate with people. It just means that God can't do it the way humans do it. Okay. Um, so again, if you're allowed to believe whatever you want to believe, and you can believe that God can violate the laws of physics and does and speaks to people, and that's fine. But then I have another question. Have human beings changed a lot in the last, say, 3,000 years? If you're Ecclesiastes, you would say nothing is new under the sun. And human beings are still the same petty, arrogant, competitive, all the negative traits, but as well all the positive traits, loving, kind, compassionate. Human beings of all these things, and we've always been all of these things. So, is there anything that indicates that humanity has changed significantly in the last 3,000 years? And despite the advances in technology, which are huge, I don't think humans have changed a whole lot. Okay, so has God changed? Well, God, we think, has been perfect. So God doesn't change. God wouldn't change. God doesn't need to change. Well, if neither of us have changed very much, why do we say that God spoke in actual audible words to human beings 3,000 years ago, but God doesn't do that today? Right? If we, yeah. So if, in
I think
fact, yeah, go
he's,
ahead.
he used to speak through to the prophets. We don't really have prophets now.
Right, right. But why would God do that then and not now? Why? What's the difference? What's changed? What makes why has God decided to stop doing
Time
that?
has changed. It's a
Yeah,
different time. It's
yeah.
later period. I mean, how many
Oh,
times you got to say something? Like,
right.
go
Yes.
clean
Oh,
up your room, right?
right. So Nick, you're on to the that's number C there. So let me just finish up with B first of all. That if nothing has changed, today, for instance, just to finish the point, if a person was to tell you that God came to them in the bedroom last night and spoke to them and said to buy stock in IBM, you might say, well, God, you didn't really hear God's voice, did you? You were like dreaming something, or you imagined something or something. No, no, no. I heard God's voice. In as clear a sound as you're talking to me now, I heard God's voice tell me to buy stock in IBM, right? So, so then you might think, well, this person needs some medication. They're hallucinating, right? Because normal people, if normally, if someone is hearing a sound that nobody else hears or sees a vision that nobody else sees, we call that a hallucination. Your brain is not working right, and you need to get some medication for that. Um, and yet the prophets claim to hear voices. Okay, so Nick's point is well taken, and that is a possible solution to this problem, and that is the analogy of parents raising their children. So when we're raising our children and they're first born, we have to do everything for them: change their diapers, feed them, cuddle them, hold them, shake them, rock them, so that they feel comfortable, that that all their needs are met. Absolutely every minute, we're on top of them to make sure they're okay. As they start to get a little older, you start to have to back off a little bit. They learn to crawl, and you have to give them space to crawl around with, to move, because they have to learn how to do that. And then they start to try to stand up, and you have to let them try to do that, and they're gonna fall down, and you have to let them fall down, and they have to let them just get up again. Maybe you need help them the first time or two. Uh, and then and once they're moving around, you need to put the child locks on the cabinets and so on, so they can't get into anything dangerous. But you need to let them move so that they can learn how to explore. They put all kinds of things in their mouth, right? And you have to teach them what to put in their mouth and not put in their mouth, etc. You teach them language, eventually teach them how to read. One day you'd send them off to school and you're not with them, and they cry and you cry, but you're separated for a period of time, but then you're back together again after a few hours. And then eventually I'm going to fast forward and they go off to college. And now you're not there. And the only time you can talk to them is when you call them on the phone. Fortunately, we have cell phones now, or you can text them. Uh, and usually they only call you when they want money. But basically, communication is very sporadic and only when called upon. right? And so there's this gradual pulling away of parents as children have to start taking responsibility for their lives. And so the analogy to humanity is that that's what God did with humanity. So in the early years, there was prophets because God was trying to communicate how to be good, how to take care of the planet, how to take care of each other. And that was God being involved, in the Garden of Eden. And in the early stories of Genesis, God seems to be really on top of them, just like we would be on top of infants. Humanity was in its infancy. But later, then the prophets are just getting phone messages from God, so to speak, right? And we can call God on the phone, right? That's called prayer, right? But other than that, the communication is sporadic and distant. Um, And so perhaps if you like that analogy, that would explain the Bible, and that's fine. So you don't have to listen to the rest of the lecture. If you're not happy with if you're not happy with that solution, then
Bye bye. See you later.
yeah, okay, that's good. If you're not happy with that solution, then I have a different solution, which is the one I'm more comfortable with. And that is, well, first of all, let me dispense with this one. Perhaps our ancestors were mistaken and they did not, in fact, hear God speak to them, right? So I'm not sure exactly what we would make of that. The ancestors were seeing things or imagining things or who knows what. Um, I, that doesn't, I don't find that satisfactory at all. I mean, then we're saying almost the prophets were psychotic, hearing voices. What I'd rather do is say that God did and still does communicate with humans, but what our ancestors described as speaking was a metaphor that we would no longer use. Perhaps God does not communicate in specific words and sentences and never did. Okay? So I'm going to give you the example of the prophet Amos from down here. Here's prophet Amos. So Amos, like many of the prophets, has an angel interpreter, and he speaks with this angel interpreter, and he sees visions, and the angel interprets them for him. And in this particular case, in chapter 7 of Amos, he says, he, either the angel or God, showed me. He was standing on a wall checked with a plumb line, and he was holding a plumb line, and the Lord asked me, "What do you see, Amos?" A plumb line, I replied. And my Lord declared, "I am going to apply a plumb line to my people Israel. I will pardon them no more. The shrines of Isaac will be laid waste, and the sanctuaries of Israel reduced to ruins. And I will turn upon the house of Jeroboam with the sword." Okay, so what is a plumb line? A plumb.
Who is Amos?
Amos. Oh, he's famous. He's a famous Amos. He made the chocolate chip cookies. Thanks for asking. No, he was one of the minor prophets. He's one of the 12 what we call minor prophets because they have small books.
Okay, and I guess I never read that far.
Yeah, that's okay. And we read a passage of Amos once or twice during the course of the year in the Haftarah section. But the famous ones are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel because they have big books. So we read different sections of those throughout the year. But then there's 12. Yeah. Then there's the 12 minor prophets who have smaller books.
Okay.
In any case, so Amos, right. The handout is in the chat room if you want. Okay. Just a note there.
Yeah, I saw it. Right.
Okay, good. So anyway, a plumb line is basically, in ancient technology, was a string that had a little rock tied at the end of it. But then they got fancy and they made the like metal arrow-shaped things that they would tie at the end of the string. And basically, if you hold the string up, because gravity pulls things straight down, you have a perpendicular line to the earth. And so if you want to check and see if a wall is being built straight or if it's crooked, it's sometimes hard to tell with the naked eye. So you'd hold this plumb line up against the wall and you can see if the wall is
Right.
aligned with the string.
Right.
So the point is that Amos sees this angel standing on a wall with a plumb line on it. And what do you see? I see a plumb line. And so I'm going to apply this plumb line. The same idea is, it clearly is a metaphor, right, for the society that Amos is in. Just like this wall is crooked and is going to have to be torn down and rebuilt, God is telling Amos, your society is crooked, is corrupt, and needs to be fixed, and therefore it needs to be torn down and built up straight again. Um, so, um, so that's the message that he wants to give Amos. So the question is, did Amos see an angel sitting on a wall holding a plumb line? Did he in fact hear this angel or God speak to him in a voice saying, this is what the message means? Or was it perhaps something else? So my view is this. Amos did not see an angel sitting on a wall with a plumb line. Amos is a guy like the rest of us, and he's reading the newspapers every day, and he's seeing, let's say, black people getting killed all the time, and the society is there's problems, and he's disturbed by the headlines he's reading, and it's there's something terribly wrong with our society. But then he has to go to work, so he folds up the Houston Chronicle, or nobody reads the paper anymore. He puts away his cell phone that he was reading the news on. I've been telling this story for a while now. You can tell.
Yeah.
In any case, he puts away his laptop, and he has to go to work. So he leaves his house and he walks down the street, because in those days they didn't have cars. So you have to walk to work, and he walks past his neighbor, and his neighbor has a construction project going on. And the construction project is they're adding a new room onto the house. And, these projects always take much longer than they're supposed to. So it's been going on for months, and most of the time Amos hasn't paid any attention to it because he's busy thinking about the horrible things he's reading in the news. Or he's thinking about work. One day, as he leaves his house and he walks past his neighbor's house, which is being worked on, for whatever reason, he looks up from his thoughts and he turns over to see what's going on, and he sees the architect standing on one of the walls with a plumb line and showing that the plumb line is crooked. And then this idea pops into Amos's head. Wow, that wall is crooked. They're going to have to tear that wall down and rebuild it. And then another idea pops into his head. Our society is crooked. Our society needs to be fixed. We need to tear down at least part of it to rebuild it straight. Okay? And then he thinks to himself, wow, where did that idea come from? And now you have the problem with the ancient language. Ancient language, they didn't have the concept of subconscious. They didn't have the language of telepathy. They didn't have the language of inspiration or something like that. So how does he, and he believes this idea came from God. How does he express that idea in words? Well, he has to use the only language he has, which is the ancient biblical Hebrew. And so he says, God showed me the wall, right? Why did I look up and see the wall that day? Because God wanted me to see the wall, right? So that's what he says. And then he says, and how did I get this idea that the wall is crooked like our society is crooked? Well, God told me what it means to see a crooked wall. He told me that that's just like our society, right? And if that's not enough to explain why he uses that language, that it's just ancient language trying to explain ideas that are more sophisticated, we would understand in a more sophisticated way with more sophisticated language, prophets also had to be dramatic to get their message across. He couldn't say, I was in therapy one day with my therapist and I had this, a vision or dream, and I was analyzing the dream and I realized the dream came from God. It's not going to capture anybody's attention. Right? God showed me this wall. God spoke to me and told me the wall is crooked, your society is crooked, it's got to be torn down and fixed. Okay? And so that's why he did that. So in this version, then, Amos is just like you and I, getting inspirations and ideas all the time. And these ideas, I personally believe, many of them come from God. When they're inspirations that teach us about how to be good, how to change the world, how to be nice to people, how to make the world a better place, I think those inspirations come from God. Okay? So that's the case of Amos. Let's just go back to my outline for a second before I go on. Yeah, so the radio transmitter, which is the next thing here. Okay, so again, I've been teaching this for a while, and I'm going to eventually, I think I may be able to get away with doing this for another few years, so because people still remember what radio receivers were, um, even if nobody uses them anymore. Okay, so in the old world, before computers, we used to hear the news on the radio. And the way we hear the news on the radio is there'd be a radio transmitter. This is the transmitter over here. And of course, God is transmitting on channel KGOD. For those who don't remember, on the West Coast, radio code signals, they're always 4 letters. The radio code signals always began with a K. And in the East Coast, they always began with a W. Okay, so this is the Texas version of God's radio station, KGOD, right? And here's his transmitter, and it's sending out messages. These are airwaves, sending out messages. But in order to receive that message, you need a radio receiver, which, for my analogy here, has 3 moving parts: an antenna, a tuner. This is the tuner knob. Now we do digital tuning, but we used to have analog tuning. You'd actually turn this knob to tune. And this is a volume knob to turn the volume up or down. Okay, so my view is that God has given human beings, and uniquely human beings, at least on this planet, radio receivers, spiritual radio receivers, to receive spiritual messages from God, who is always transmitting these messages. And the trick for human beings is to develop your antenna so that it works to pull in the signal, to make sure that your tuner is tuned into the right station, and then to turn the volume up so that you can hear the message over the noise of our daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
And prophets were especially attuned to KGOD. They had developed their antennas to a significant degree. They made sure to tune in to the right station, and they had turned up the volume to hear the message. And that's what made prophets prophets.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, however, this message does not come, in my view. I mean, you could still say it comes across in words, right? God could be telepathy, in a form of telepathy that's not audible sounds, could still be transmitting specific words. But my particular view, and this is relates to what we'll talk about at the end of the class, is that God is really only transmitting abstract concepts and not specific words.
Not like he did with Moses?
Yeah, so let me give an example for Moses. Thank you for asking. So let's take Moses, please. No, so let's take Moses. So one of the classic stories about Moses is, right, he's tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, and he sees the burning bush. And in the text it says he saw this bush that seemed to be burning, but not being extinguished, not getting destroyed by the fire, and it seemed strange. So it said, "Let me turn aside and see this strange sight." I think that's something like that it says.
Yeah.
So he turns aside and looks at it. Okay. So the first thing is, there's a way to explain this biologically. Some people say there are plants that grow in the Middle East that have very waxy, oily leaves that can seem to burn for a long time without being destroyed. Maybe he saw one of those. Whatever it was something weird. The Midrash says the bush had been burning for some time and people had been passing by not noticing it at all. It was Moses who took the initial initiative to notice that there's something unusual there. I better go take a look, right? And then he hears this message from God. So now let me reinterpret what the message is that he hears from God. He sees the bush, and just like Amos, this insight, this inspiration comes into his head. Back in Egypt, my people, I mean, he knew who was back in Egypt. He'd been away from them from a few years, but he killed an Egyptian taskmaster because of the horrible things that were happening there. He knew what was going on there. Um, and now he sees this bush, and for whatever reason, this idea comes into his head. My people are burning under slavery in Egypt, like this bush is burning. And yeah, this bush seems to be lasting a long time with this fire. How long can those Israelites survive under the
So that's your interpretation, obviously.
yes. And then he has a whole conversation in his head, or you could say with God, which I'm happy to say I think it was with God, right?
Yes.
What can I do about that? I'm just a shepherd. No, Moses, you got to go. You grew up in the Pharaoh's household. You know what that's like. You can talk to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was your brother, right, when you were there. And he was. He was like a stepbrother. Um, you know how the test system works. They're going to listen to you. If you don't go, who's going to go? You're the only guy. No, I don't speak so well. Doesn't matter, right? And so it's this struggle inside his head, and I believe part of this is God giving him inspiration and courage and strength, right? He finally decides, okay, I guess I have to go back. Okay? And it gets written down the way it gets written down. But that's what actually happened, in my opinion. Maybe a little bit, I don't know, who knows what actually happened. Nobody was there with a video camera. But my view is that's a more likely scenario as to what actually happened than God, booming voice speaking to Moses. And by the way, modern filmmakers, I think it was Prince of Egypt, I forget which one, but I think it was Prince of Egypt, has the voice of God coming out of the burning bush actually the same actor as the one who plays Moses.
My interpretation is God allowed him to see the burning bush, and he didn't allow anybody else to see it.
Yeah.
So I don't. Right.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly look. No, that's certainly possible too. I'm going to give you one way, and then I'm going to give you several different. At the end of the class, I have several different ways of looking at things. This is just my particular way of putting the pieces together.
I won't interject.
What?
Okay. I won't interject. I'm just listening now.
That's okay. Okay, so that's the before we look at the okay, let's take a look at it now. Okay, so there are different ways of looking at it. So let's I think, can you see the conservative Judaism, our ancestors to our descendants?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, so this is an excerpt from a book by Elliot Dorff, and I mentioned a couple of my other teachers, Neil Gilman and so on. I mean, Elliot Dorff, for me, was the formative teacher really for my education. I think my serious Jewish education. And he is such a brilliant, first of all, he's just a nice, kind, compassionate guy. When he smiles, he lights up the room. Just a really nice, but extremely thoughtful, very brilliant, and is able to take complicated subjects and make them seem simple by writing them in plain English. In any case, he wrote a book. It was supposed to be for high school kids, for the high school kids in our movement, United Synagogue Youth, in 1996, called Conservative Judaism, Our Ancestors to Our Descendants, where he tried to explain what our movement is about. And part of this book was, this is a small section, and I've given just excerpts, The Question of Authority, Orthodox Reform, and Four Conservative Theories of Revelation. So he opens, this is the second part of the handout that you get. He opens with the quote, why do we observe Mitzvot? Well, because God spoke to Moses at Sinai, duh, right? Except that he then says, after going on with the traditional view, he says, why then should we go any further? Why should we not simply say that you should observe the law because its root is the Torah and that is the will of God? Well, many do say that. Okay, so if you're happy with that answer, then you don't have to read the rest of the book. But some do not. And even those who do hold that position feel compelled to deal with two problems in that assertion. The first concerns the act of revelation, and the second revolves around its product. In regard to the act of revelation, we ask, what exactly did happen at Sinai? How do we know it was God speaking? Perhaps the whole account of Revelation at Sinai is simply a product of someone's imagination. Even if God did speak, how do we know that he was understood correctly? And the second is the product of revelation, that is the Torah. We ask, is this the direct transcription of God's words? If so, how do we explain some of the contradictions in its laws? And I didn't talk about contradictions in laws last week, but there are a series of those as well, not just in the stories, but in the laws. And here he gives some of them. How do we explain the similarity of some of the laws and stories to those of surrounding nations, like flood stories and an eye for an eye? You see this in other surrounding cultures. What about the variant versions of the Bible, right? The different stories that I explained last week. Even if God revealed his will at Sinai, human beings have copied it and interpreted it through the generations. How can we be assured that we have in hand is anything like what God gave? And how do we know that our interpretation of it is anything like what God intended or wants us to do now? And then he provides this chart, and this chart is in 2 pages. So what you want to do is print out this page, and then put them side by side so they line up across, right? So in the chart, he gives you Orthodox and 4 conservative views, and then the Reform view. By the way, he could have said modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. What he could have divided Orthodox up, and he could have divided Reform. But he's writing a book for conservative Jews, so he wanted to spend more time explaining the different conservative views. And then he gives you classic interpreters of each view. So this is Eliezer Berkowitz and Norman Lamb. These are different conservative thinkers in the version 1, conservative thinkers in version 2, conservative thinkers version 3. You can see Elliot Dorff puts himself in this category. Mordechai Kaplan is conservative 4, which is really the Reconstructionist movement now. And then the Reform movement is several over here. And then the next column is the method of how they study the Torah. And then the next 3 columns are the nature of revelation, what exactly was revealed, the authority of the ideas, and our ability to interpret and change ideas we find in the Bible.
What's the difference between all the conservative sub-listings, conservative 1, 2, and 3?
Yeah. So he then goes on in the rest of this is just the chart that sort of gives the overview. Then he goes on in the rest of the text to explain in more detail what each of those mean.
Okay.
So here's the Orthodox view summarized.
I see. Thank you.
And then conservative 1 through 4. Unfortunately, in your handout, all you have is the summary of conservative 1 through 4. So I give you the gray, and because it's gray, the Xerox copy didn't come out so good.
I can see it.
That's the summary of each of the 4 positions.
Okay, great.
And then he gives you some about the Reform. Now, if you're really excited and you really want to see some more, let me just show you something else. I discovered when I was preparing for the class, I always like to update things. So I was preparing for the class, and I found this. So this is a page where conservative Judaism, our ancestors, our descendants, somebody has, with permission from United Synagogue, uploaded huge sections of that book. And so the section that you would be the section that I highlighted there was Jewish law within the conservative movement. Tradition and change in rabbinic literature. And if you click here, it takes you to this. The chart doesn't come out so well, but you get much more information about each of the conservative views and how they developed. Right? So if you're interested in that, you can read huge sections of the book. It's kind of in this format. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, so that's Elliot Dorff. Oh, you know what? I should show you one other thing while we're there. Whoops. Sorry. Come back. Okay. I got to share the screen again. And there's another page I want to show you while we're on the internet. So I give you the URL for this also. This is one of my other teachers. Um, when after I graduated from the University of Arizona, and before I decided to go to law school, I thought I'd take a year off and study Jewish law. And somebody had told me if you study Talmud, it's good practice for law school. So
Mhm.
always wanted to go to Israel, and I had saved up some money. So I very frugally spent a year in Israel. Half of that year, I was on an ulpan in Arad, which is an intensive Hebrew study program, and I was staying at an absorption center. They still had those in Israel for new immigrants, a place for them to stay for 6 months while they get adjusted to Israeli culture. This was a program for English-speaking Jews from around the world to come and study in Israel for a year. This first 6 months would be in this ulpan, and in addition to learning Hebrew, they provided some Jewish studies classes. And two of the classes that I took were taught by a rabbi named Simcha Roth. Now, at the time, Simcha Roth was a rabbi from England who had made Aliyah, so he had this wonderful British accent. And he was just a brilliant and very fun teacher, um, but he was Orthodox. Since then, he later left Orthodoxy and joined our movement in Israel and served as a rabbi in one of the conservative synagogues in Israel for the rest of his life. But at the time I knew him, he was still Orthodox. And when he was conservative, he produced this amazing web page, but he passed away a few years ago. But he produced this amazing web page, which included studying the Mishnah, the entire Mishnah, with his commentary, study of different issues of Jewish law, halakha, and hashkafa. So this is the page on hashkafa, which means Jewish viewpoint or philosophy. And if you go to down here, I wanted to show you this web page. So you go here, a brief introduction. Oh, sorry, not that. Masorti conservative ideology. See this over here where the arrow's pointing?
Yes.
Historical background, God, revelation, halakha and mitzvot, theodicy. These are exactly the subjects I'm covering. And so you will get essays by Simcha Roth on how he interpreted each of these problems. What is the nature of God? The nature of revelation? What is the authority of halakha? And theodicy is the question of why do bad things happen to good people? Right? So this is his explanation of those things. He's a brilliant, a brilliant guy. I took his class in Maimonides. It was my introduction to Maimonides. And it was, after that, I was totally in love with Maimonides. I've since discovered that there's some flaws in Maimonides, but, you know, there is with everybody. So, but it was a great class. Anyway, so I just wanted to show you those two things. And now we're going to go back to sharing the outline of the class. Okay, so to find those two things, you can go to this for further reading. And Concerted Judaism, Our Ancestors or Our Descendants can be found at this website. That was the website I showed you. And go to this section, Theology, Questions of Authority. That's where it is. And the other one is Simcha Roth, Beit Midrash Virtuality. And if you click this link, that takes you to that Hashkafa page we were looking at.
Wow. Thank you.
There are two other books, if you're interested in books, that I would recommend. One is Mention Maimonides. So his book, Guide for the Perplexed, is an attempt to reconcile science and religion in his day, which is the 12th century, and is still a useful book for that purpose. And this is a modern interpretation of Maimonides by another one of my teachers, Mika Goodman, who's a new young scholar, wrote this nice book about Maimonides. For philosophical types who want to understand what Maimonides was saying. And the other book I recommend is another book by Elliot Dorff called Knowing God, Jewish Journeys to the Unknowable. It's an easy to read book, unfortunately out of print. But I think you can get a cheap copy at Amazon if you want to get a used one. And here is Elliot Dorff explaining his understanding of God and how we can know anything about God, how we can communicate with God, and how God might communicate with us. Okay, so now let's go back to, so we have these conservative 1, 2, 3, 4s. Now, what I want to do is explain, first of all, how my interpretation of Revelation would explain some of the problems people have with the Bible. So, first of all, how do you explain miracles in the Bible? Plagues in Egypt, parting of the Red Sea, getting water from the rock. The sun standing still for Joshua, actually, that's an easy one to explain, in my opinion. Um, so, there was a battle, and the Israelites were winning, but the sun was going down, and they weren't able, the question was, were they going to be able to finish the battle and win the day? Or, would the sun go down, and then the enemy would have time to regroup, and we'd have to fight another battle, maybe lose the next day. So the sun stood still for Joshua. So my simple explanation for that is that the earth did not stop rotating, because if God had caused, first of all, God doesn't interfere with nature, but if God had caused the earth to stop rotating, as somebody would have said, mountains would have flown off the earth's surface, etc., because of centrifugal force, it would have been a horrific event. So that's not likely. So what more likely happened is simply a phenomenon that everybody experiences from time to time, and that is when we're engaged in activity, one of two things happens. Sometimes it seems like time flies, right? Oh my God, it's already 5 o'clock. It seems like just an hour ago I started. You're really engaged in something, and time just goes by without you realizing it. And the other phenomenon is you're engaged in some activity and time seems to take forever. And that's the case of the sun standing still for Joshua, right? This battle raged, it seemed like forever, right? The sun didn't stand still. It just seemed like it because this battle was going on so long. Okay, that's the sun standing still. Waters from rock. I mean, other people have tried to explain how each of these miracles could have happened using laws of physics. It doesn't interest me or concern me, frankly, because I don't know how we'd ever be able to prove it. And it's not in some ways, it's not the important part of the story. Um, the fact that we were slaves and that we escaped, that's crucial. And Richard Elliott Friedman, who is a modern Bible scholar, um, demonstrates, at least to his conviction, that that actually happened. We were in fact slaves, and we did in fact escape. Um, the details of it are not so important, and again, if the story is being told orally over generations before being written down, it's quite likely that the story was embellished over time. So things that seemed miraculous at first became even more miraculous over time, and to figure out what exactly the original core of the story was is not easy to do. But that's only if you're interested in what really happened historically. The other aspect of it, as I said before, when we were talking about how do you read the Bible, is what do you interpret from the way the Bible is written as it's written today? I mean, I do believe that the words are divinely inspired, precisely the way we have it today, because I think the whole process of editing the Bible was also divinely inspired. And the process of interpreting the Bible is divinely inspired. So how we read the text with every single word and little jot and tittle is important, because I think the whole thing is telling us something that we need to know about how to live our lives. And I think that's part of God's plan. That's how God designed it, how God inspired it. In the process of getting it written down, the process of editing it, and now the process of interpreting it. So does it matter that the first creation story is bad science? No. I mean, first of all, if God is trying to explain Big Bang and evolution to somebody 3,000 years ago, it would have failed. The person would have said, "You're crazy. I don't know what a cell is. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. Those stars are just orbiting around the Earth. They're not millions of light years, whatever that means, away from us," right? It just wouldn't have made sense. And the second story of creation with snakes talking is not intended to be real. It's intended to tell us something about the nature of humanity. What it's trying to tell us is that we have free will, and we can choose to do the right thing or not to do the right thing, to be tempted or not to be tempted, right? And so that's much more important than the fable. Okay, how do you understand the process of revelation to explain changes in the law, right? So in Deuteronomy, there's a passage that says if you have a stubborn and rebellious son, you're supposed to stone them to death. I would never dream that God would actually intend us to stone our children because they complain and argue. Right? That's ridiculous. Um, Somebody misunderstood, perhaps. Or perhaps it was intended to be the ultimate threat, like I'm going to call the police, we might say today, right? Um, Something to, in order to help parents to train their children. But no way would we ever want to actually stone our children. So what did the rabbis of the Talmudic era do 2,000 years ago? Well, they weren't going to eliminate the passage altogether because they couldn't. It was in the text. But what they did was they put on their lawyer hats and they defined the problem out of existence. They said that the son has to be um, less than 13 years old, because if he's 13 years old, he's an adult. He's no longer under your control, and he can be rebellious if he wants to. Just kick him out of the house and let him live his own life. We wouldn't do that at 13 today, but that could be done in an agrarian society. So they had to be younger than 13 years old. But if they're too young, like they're 10 years old, what are you coming to the elders of the city to complain about your kids for? All kids are stubborn and rebellious. You're parents, you're supposed to train them. So don't bother us. So they said it can only be a child who's between 12 and a half years old and 13 years old, that 6-month window. And then they said it's only sons and not daughters, and choosing to interpret the male noun, plural noun, as only males this time. Other times they include women, but this time they chose to exclude women. So they excluded half their population there. And they created all kinds of other criteria to make it impossible to be a stubborn and rebellious child. And then at the conclusion of this long Talmudic discussion, they said, surprise, we never had a case of a stubborn, rebellious child. End of story. Right? So that's how we get around stoning our kids. And I'm perfectly happy with that, because I think that their interpretation was divinely inspired to do away with a problem in the text that was a misinterpretation of God's will. That's how I look at it. The soda water is a simple thing. I like to call it the soda water because of the nice, if you're saying it instead of reading it, it implies something else. So the soda water. So a woman who is suspected of committing adultery is called a sotah. And the punishment is that her husband is to take her to the priests, who write out something including God's name on a piece of parchment, some magical incantation, and then swish it in this water combined with some dust from where the altar is in the Holy of Holies. And the whole thing is swished together, and the woman has to drink this mixture with the ink and dirt mixed in. And if she gets sick, then she's guilty. And if she doesn't get sick, then she did not commit this sin, and the husband has to reconcile with her. Right? This is the only trial by ordeal in the Bible. It's a bizarre ritual, and so I called it the soda water. And again, the rabbis of the Talmudic era did away with it. They said, well, that never really worked, so there was a lot of licentiousness, and it didn't really solve anything, so we just decided to stop doing it. That may be a bit of an exaggeration, but basically they did do away with the whole concept. And then, of course, there's several passages in the Bible that talk about an eye for an eye. If you poke out an eye, then your eye gets poked out. That's what it seems to say. You cut off somebody's hand, they cut off your hand. But again, 2,000 years ago, the rabbis of the Talmud said, that's ridiculous. That's not what that text means. It means you pay money to compensate for the lost eye. And here's another passage of the Bible that says you have to cure the person, so now you got to pay for his medical expenses. And here's another passage that says that until he's able to go back to work, you have to compensate him, so you have to pay for his lost wages. And here's another passage that talks about pain and suffering, so you got to pay for pain and suffering. And before you know it, their code of what we call personal injury damages, it reads a lot like American personal injury damages. You pay for the loss, you pay for pain and suffering, for medical expenses, time lost from work, and if you did it on purpose, you pay a fine, a penalty. So they created this system out of whole cloth 2,000 years ago. And at each step in the Talmud, there's always this rabbi, the same rabbi, who argues, no, no, it really means an eye for an eye. It really means an eye for an eye. And the rabbis insist, no, it doesn't. It can't mean that. um, and so they rewrite the Bible. But again, like I would say, so that's okay because the rabbis were divinely inspired to make these changes. Somebody had a question.
I had my hand up
Oh
online.
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I remember reading someplace, somewhere, that the eye for an eye was trying to emphasize that you don't take a life for hurting a
Yes.
finger. That it's not so much it's to avoid the overreaction. You don't charge somebody with
Right.
grand theft when they steal a pencil.
Right.
Can't think of any other examples. Can you comment on that?
Yes. So, so we have this language in Hammurabi's code, which is a code from the Mesopotamia. I think it predates the passages in the Torah. But in Hammurabi's code, it depends on who cut off whose hand, right? So if somebody of the upper class cut off the poor class, the hand of somebody in the poor class, then he compensates him for the lost hand. But if somebody in the poor class cut off the hand of somebody in the upper class, he was killed. And so, right. So the first thing that the Bible is coming to do is say, no, it's the same law for everybody. We're not making distinctions between class system here. Everybody is the same. And that is actually a huge moral development in the Bible. Goes back to Genesis. Everybody's created in God's image. Everybody has infinite worth, has the same worth. We're all related to each other. We're all of equal worth, right? And that's emphasized in this hand-for-hand concept in the Bible. But the rabbis took it one step further. It's not. We're not even going to cut off the hand anymore. We're just going to compensate for the hand. So that's what that is. Okay, let me go back to. I just want to go through a couple more things. We're going to look at the rabbinical stories that seem to agree with me. So I'm going to explain why I'm not, although I call it unorthodox Jewish beliefs. If you read the rabbinic writings in a certain way, you'll see that they're really conservative rabbis, in my opinion. Okay. And here's a question I'm going to leave you with at the end of the class is, how does the process of revelation explain the value and meaning of the Torah for you? How does whatever process of revelation you decide is how it happened, how does that explain the meaning of the Torah for you? My view is that although God did not speak in discrete words and syllables that have universal meaning and we could clearly understand what God intended, but rather God spoke with images and ideas and inspirations and concepts, right, that are a little more difficult to, that then humans have to interpret and then have to put into human language and write down, right? So there's a lot of possibility for human error in the process. Nevertheless, we've had literally hundreds of experts, hundreds of these people with finely tuned radio receivers getting these messages from God, engaged in the project of trying to understand what God wants for us over the thousands of years. And that is sort of the scientific process applied to religion, right? The scientific process is running dozens of experiments and achieving the same results to confirm that this is how the universe works. So we've had hundreds and thousands, really, of people doing the same revelation experiment and coming to the same conclusion, moving in the same direction to try and understand what it is that God wants from us. And we're all pretty much certain about what the ultimate truths are that our religion is trying to teach us, right? Everybody in every generation is limited by the culture that we live in, right? So an eye for an eye, a hand for a hand may make sense 3,000 years ago, but it didn't make sense 2,000 years ago. The 6 days of creation may have made sense 6,000 years ago, but it doesn't make sense today. We're limited in our ability to understand God's message by the culture we live in, the nature of science of our time, our own personal history and education, our individual capacity to imagine. But by engaging more people over centuries and continuing to revise and refine our interpretations and understandings, we get ever closer to God's intended message. That's my view of Revelation and why that requires all of us in this it's kind of an exciting thing actually. Our generation and our children's generation are engaged in this project of trying to understand even better what it is God wants from us. And yeah, we have a lot of responsibility to try and figure that out, and we have to be careful how we do it. And we have to study and learn, and certainly study what's gone on before. No scientist runs an experiment until he understands what the science up to his day has already concluded, right? So we have to study our tradition and learn what we can, and then take the next step to better understand even better what God wants from us. Okay, Daniel, go ahead, and then I'm going to look at some rabbinic sources at the end.
Okay, well, don't let me slow this down, but something has happened, in my perspective, something has happened over the last, in my lifetime, where what we used to do is say we had rabbinical authorities who looked at passages like this, made an interpretation, and presented some kind of argument for it in writing. That carried a lot of authority, and that's always been the basis of what we call rabbinic Judaism. Rabbis make these interpretations. What seems to me happening is that all kinds of groups and all kinds of individuals are making interpretations. And it's almost like the idea of a authoritative source that's educated studying this stuff and making those pronouncements, if you will, is losing favor. It's like everybody gets to decide what is meant, on their own.
Right.
Can you comment on that? Do you see that, or is it just me?
Yeah, so I mean that's a really good point, and then it sort of gets to a fundamental question, which is who has the right to make these decisions, and how do we know, that they're making the right decisions, which are all really tricky, important questions. So some of the reading in the Elliot Dorff book, and the two websites I showed you, may help with that to some extent. So what I would say kind of briefly is, the more you study the Jewish sources, the more authentic your interpretation of what Judaism has to say is going to be, right? So unfortunately, the people who haven't had any rabbinic training, or have had only modest rabbinic training, for them to kind of say, well, I read this midrash, or I read this passage of Torah, and therefore now I know this is what it means. You don't have the scope and breadth and depth of wisdom that our ancestors have provided already. It's kind of like, my analogy is, if you think about religion as software. So yeah, maybe this is an important thing to do here. So think about religion as software. So the human being is like a computer in a way, right? And we have part of our brain is our memory capacity, so that's the hard drive. Part of our brain processes data, that's the CPU. And we seem to be given sort of an operating system that we have to develop a little bit. That teaches us how to use the five senses to bring in data and interpret the world around us. But then we go to school and we get software packages of science and math and history and language. And those software packages have already developed a lot of wisdom and knowledge in them. So now once we learn how to use them, we can process even better the understanding of the world around us. But part of our processing, our operating system, includes this inquisitive drive to understand the big questions. Why are we here? What is this all about? Is there a creator? And if there is a creator, what does he want from us? Right? And for that, we get religious software packages. And there's a lot of different religious software packages out in the world, right? Christianity and different forms of Christianity, and Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism and Islam and Judaism. So you can run whatever software, we're in a free market system now. Choose whatever system you like. But, most people are born into one system and are given the basic tools to use that system. I happen to think Judaism is a brilliant system, and I'm a little biased, obviously. And so I think we have an amazing software package that enables us to do this really, really, really well and efficiently if we use it right. And I'm happy to make that argument in the marketplace of ideas. Not to denigrate anybody else's software package, but just I think ours is pretty brilliant. And but here's the thing. Do you think you are capable of starting from scratch and writing your own software package? Right? I wouldn't even. I would know how to write a real computer software package, let alone something that does word processing. I'd rather just learn how to use Word better so I can be more efficient at using Word, right? And I'd say the same thing with religious software. Why start all over again when there's so many religious packages out there? You want Judaism? Study Judaism really well. The more you learn about it, the more effective you're going to be at using it to answer these questions. Because it's a brilliant package and it does a really excellent job doing it, right? It helps you to live a good life and to have a relationship with God and to create a community that cares about each other. I mean, it does a lot of wonderful things. It's a brilliant package, and the more you learn about it, the more you'll realize how brilliant it is. Once you study it and you really get it, you want to tinker with it, right? You make some macros for yourself, do some upgrades, whatever. Or if, like Word, you don't have to use all the bells and whistles that Word has to offer to be effective at using Word, right? So, so you don't have to learn all the bells and whistles of Judaism to be effective at using Judaism. But to tinker with it without really understanding it would be a mistake in my opinion. So that's why we should leave it to people who know what they're doing. And so that's my kind of view.
All right, thank you very much. I was listening with rapt attention. Thank you.
Okay, now let me just go through. I just want to show you a couple things. I'm running over time, but I do want to show you a couple examples where the rabbis seem to be saying pretty much what I said. We are divinely inspired to interpret and even reinterpret God's law to fit the needs of our time. Right, so this one over here, I'm just going to summarize some of these. This is from the Jerusalem Talmud, where it says God spoke to Moses. All the time in the Bible it says God spoke to Moses. Why didn't God just write the Torah out himself? Why did he speak to Moses and let Moses write it down? And the answer they give is because that gave Moses and subsequent generations flexibility in how they interpret the Torah. I mean, that's literally what they say here. Look, it says, God replied, follow the majority opinion. If the majority of rabbis favors permitting something, you permit it. If they favor prohibiting something, you prohibit it. In this way, it's going to be possible to interpret the Torah in 49 different ways to permit something and 49 ways to prohibit it, right? They're literally telling you, we can put on our lawyer hats and we can interpret this thing to death to make it mean almost whatever we want it to mean. And then you follow the majority, just like you do in science. You run the experiment several times and you find out what the best results are, right? And they basically tell you that here. This is a great story over here. The Seder Eliyahu Zuta is a collection of midrash. And so it's like a human being, a king, who gives two servants, whom he loved dearly, a measure of wheat and a stalk of flax. The clever one takes the flax and makes a cloth out of it. That's how you make a linen cloth. Linen comes from flax. And he takes the wheat and he turns it into flour. He sifts it, he grounds it, he kneads it, he bakes it into bread. He lays it on a table, the cloth on top, and the king comes back. The foolish one did nothing. The king comes back and he says, bring me what I gave you. One of them brings the bread with the cloth on top, and the other comes back with the same measure of wheat and the stalk of flax. Oh, the shame of it, the rabbi says. Which one do you think the king loved more? You must agree it was the one who brought out his bread with the cloth on top of it. And in the same way, God gave the Torah to Israel only as wheat and flax. and it's up to us to turn it into bread and cloth. Wow. I mean, can you be any more explicit than that? This is the basic material. You have to play with it to make it better. I mean, um, the next one is the story of, it's a famous story that's often told, particularly by conservative rabbis, about Moses going up to Rabbi Akiva's schoolhouse. I know I'm going to have to quit soon. Somebody's telling me to quit soon, right? Um, so Moses goes up to Rabbi Akiva's schoolhouse, and he's sitting in the back row. The rabbis are very, the person who told the story is very particular to tell you he's sitting in the back row. In those days, the schoolhouse was designed so that the smart students sit in the front and the lesser smart students sit in the back. I mean, the rabbis are being pretty presumptuous here. Moses, our teacher, is sitting in the back row of Rabbi Akiva's schoolhouse, right? And Akiva is expounding the laws, and soon at a particular point, the student asked the master, that is Rabbi Akiva, how he knew what the law was, and he replied, "This was a law given to Moses at Sinai." And Moses, who was totally confused up until now, didn't even understand what Akiva was saying, feels better. And he says, wow, you have a guy like this and you gave the Torah to me? I won't continue the story. It's not important. But let me just analogize to the American Supreme Court. You know, some people on the Supreme Court today want to say, well, what did the founding fathers say? You know, so imagine Thomas Jefferson sitting on the Supreme Court today in a question about Twitter and First Amendment rights and the internet. I mean, Thomas Jefferson wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about, right? Because the technology in his day was nothing like today. He wouldn't even know where to begin. So who cares what the founding fathers think, right? I mean, they gave us the principles and we need to apply them. That's basically like Moses and Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash. Okay. I already talked about the one where the rabbi says that when at the Ten Commandments, God was like a statue looking at each person individually, and each person understood what God was trying to say in their own particular capacity. Again, that's my concept of revelation. That's not a revelation of specific words. That's each person getting a particular message that they can understand. And then this is the one about going to the judges of your day. Don't ask, how come we don't have Moses today? You don't have Moses. You got the judges in your day. So ask them, and they'll answer. And then this is the famous oven of Achnai. I'll let you read it on its own. It's a weird story. But basically, one rabbi who has a perfect memory says, I'm telling you, this is what God said. This is what the law says. And everybody disagreed with him. And then he brings supernatural proof to prove that he's right. And they say, we don't take supernatural proof. This is a court of law. And finally, God's voice booms out and says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And the rabbis jump back and say, stay out of it, God. We're having an argument. You gave the Torah to us. And the end of the story is God was happy. God laughed and was happy. My children have defeated me. So again, many, many stories in the rabbinic literature that they understood and knew that they were changing God's law, but that's precisely what God wanted them to do, to interpret the law for the time that they lived in, to make it relevant and meaningful in the time they lived in, because times change, society changes, culture changes, science changes, and we need to be able to adapt to make it fit the times we live in. Okay, that maybe left you with more questions. Do we have time? Maybe 2 more minutes if anybody wants to ask a final question. Okay, so there are the other reading materials, and I'm happy to answer any other questions. I'm not too good with emails these days. I'm getting bombarded with a lot of emails. Call me. Call Lisa, make an appointment. We can Zoom. We'll have a Zoom conference. I'm always available for meetings. I get bombarded with lots of emails, so it's hard to keep up.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hopefully this answers or helps to answer some questions. And again, there's conservative 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm kind of with Elliot Dorff in number 3, but you're welcome to be in number 1, which is a more specific revelation. And read the text about how that's explained and see if that fits how you think it worked.
Thank you, Rabbi. This is great.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you, Rabbi.
Very helpful.
Okay.
Have a great day. Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Adios.
It was wonderful, Rabbi.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay,
All
see
right.
you next week.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Put your hand on the glass.
Oh.
I'm just kidding. Bye, man.
Bye-bye.